pale winter light hangs over the horizon, the kind that turns the world into a quiet painting of grays and soft blues. Snow drifts across an empty field, moving like a slow breath over the frozen earth. In the distance, the remnants of war lie half-buried, an overturned cart, a torn scarf caught in a branch, boot prints frozen into place as if the world stopped mid-stride. Nothing moves now except the wind, brushing gently against the scattered memories left behind. It is the kind of silence that arrives only after great noise, a silence thick enough to feel on the skin. As the cold settles deeper, it wraps the land in a fragile stillness, as though it is trying to protect whatever life remains. Somewhere beyond the white horizon, faint echoes of artillery linger like ghosts, softened by distance and snowfall. But here, in this small corner of winter, the violence feels far away, replaced by an almost tender.
And within this hush, the story begins. Not with gunfire, but with silence, waiting to be understood. Field hospitals during the war stood as strange islands of mercy amid a landscape shaped by fire and ruin. Their canvas walls trembled in the wind, stitched together with whatever could be spared. Yet inside them lived a different rhythm, one marked not by commands or explosions, but by hurried whispers and steady hands. The smell of disinfectant mixed with mud, blood, and melting snow, creating an atmosphere both hopeful and unbearably fragile. Lanterns swung from poles, casting warm circles of light on tired faces, illuminating the quiet urgency of those who fought a different kind of battle. Here, soldiers from every side arrived, stripped of their uniform's meaning. Once they crossed the threshold, they were not enemies or allies, only wounded bodies searching for breath, warmth, and a chance to return to themselves. Nurses moved between cots with the calm focus of people who had learned to hold chaos gently, while doctors worked with a weary precision forged under impossible pressure. Outside,
they hesitated at the entrance, unsure whether to trust what lay before them. These were enemy hands, after all, but hands that held bandages instead of rifles. A few men lowered their eyes, bracing for harshness that never came. Instead, they were guided toward empty cots, their trembling steps softened by fatigue rather than resistance.
In that moment, the lines of war blurred. They were simply wounded men seeking rest, carrying stories they had no strength left to tell. They were known simply as the Sisters, a name that carried more truth than formality. Most of them were young women from small villages, places where winters were long and work began before sunrise. They have grown up learning how to mend torn clothes, soothe fevers with warm cloths, and sing quietly to calm frightened children during storms. Hardship was not new to them. It had shaped their hands and their spirits long before the war arrived. When they volunteered or were assigned to serve as nurses, they brought with them that same quiet endurance, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but becomes unmistakable the longer you watch it. Their days began before dawn, when the cold seeped through the thin hospital walls and made every movement feel heavier. They washed their faces with icy water, braided their hair with numb fingers, and stepped into uniforms that never quite dried between shifts. Supplies were scarce, meals were hurried, and rest came in fragments. Yet whenever a wounded man called out, they rose without complaint, moving with a step.
Despite the endless weight of suffering around them, there was something unbreakable in their presence. It was not loud or dramatic. It was the kind of resilience that grows from years of weathering both harsh winters and difficult lives. In their quiet determination, a kind of warmth lived, one that could not be dimmed by war's shadows, and would soon soften the hearts of men who never expected kindness from those dressed in white. Their way of caring was shaped long before the war, rooted in a culture where tenderness was not considered weakness, but a necessary thread in the fabric of survival. In their villages, compassion was a shared resource. Inside the hospital, this philosophy became their quiet compass. They understood that a clean bandage or a cup of warm broth meant more than just treatment. It meant reminding a suffering man that someone still cared whether he lived. Even when the wounded were strangers or former enemies, they approached each cot with the same steady resolve. It wasn't forgiveness, nor was it naivete. It was a belief that cruelty should never be answered with more cruelty. And in their calm, patient ways, they tried to prove that kindness could still survive amid the ruins. Officially, the nurses were expected to maintain a strict emotional distance from enemy prisoners. The rules were clear: provide the minimum care required, follow orders, avoid unnecessary conversation, and remember that the men lying before them had once marched under a flag meant to destroy their homeland. Some soldiers and officers even carried quiet suspicions, believing compassion toward the enemy might soften the resolve needed to endure the war. Yet when the nurses stood beside those narrow cots and looked at,
They saw not uniforms, but trembling hands, chapped lips, and eyes clouded with pain. The prisoners' fear was unmistakable, fear not only of injury, but of what treatment they might receive from those they had been taught to hate. Instead of coldness, the nurses chose calm voices and careful gestures. They wrapped wounds with the same attention they gave their own soldiers, and sometimes, when no one else was watching, they offered a small smile or a few quiet words in halting German or simple human tone. Their choices didn't defy the war outright, but they softened its edges. And in that softening, something unexpected began to take shape, something that would soon change the entire atmosphere of the ward. Night settled over the field hospital like a...
the cold seeped in through the seams of the tent, brushing their faces like a reminder of the world they were no longer prepared to face. Breath formed faint clouds in the dim light. A distant howl of wind traveled along the frozen ground, sounding almost like a mournful voice calling out across the snow. The lantern swayed gently, sending warm circles of light drifting across tired faces, then slipping away again. Even the nurses moved more quietly than usual, as if afraid that any sudden sound might unravel what little peace existed. For the prisoners, exhaustion carried its own sharp edges. Pain throbbed in limbs that refused to heal quickly, and the weight of uncertainty pressed on their chests. Uncertainty about tomorrow, about home, about whether they would ever see familiar fields or warm kitchens again. They were surrounded by strangers, tended to by women they did not expect kindness from, and held in a place where their fate felt suspended between mercy and fear. In that fragile space, where silence felt both comforting and unbearable, the night stretched long and heavy. And as it deepened, something unplanned and entirely human was about to unfold, something that would shift the air in the ward in a way none of the men could have imagined.
It began so softly that most of the men didn't register it at first. A single voice, low and warm, drifted through the dim ward like a thread of light slipping under a closed door. It wasn't a command or a medical instruction. It was a melody, simple, almost fragile, carried on a breath steady enough to feel motherly. The sound moved through the lantern glow, brushing past weary faces and settling gently in the cold spaces between the beds. For a moment, the prisoners lay still, unsure whether the sound was real or something their minds had conjured out of longing and fatigue. Then another voice joined the first, harmonizing with the ease of someone who had done this many times before. The notes rose and fell with the rhythm of a lullaby, the kind sung in cottages beside wooden cradles, not in places built to house the wounded and the defeated. The Germans, startled by the tenderness, turned their heads slightly, their eyes searching the dimness for an explanation. Some frowned at first, suspicious of anything unfamiliar. But suspicion softened quickly into something quiet.
The nurses sang without looking for recognition. Their voices wrapped around the room, smoothing the edges of fear and loneliness, settling like warm snow on the coldest memories. The prisoners didn't understand the words, but they understood the feeling. A feeling that slipped past all language and rested directly in the heart. And as the lullaby carried on, the ward seemed to breathe differently, as if even the walls paused to listen, sensing that something extraordinary had just begun. For the nurses, singing was not a performance, but a natural response to suffering, something woven into the rhythm of their upbringing. In their childhood homes, lullabies were as essential as warm soup or a hand on the shoulder during hard seasons. They were sung to soothe fevered children, to ease the fear of storms, or simply to remind a restless heart that it wasn't alone. Even as adults, the songs lived quietly inside them, carrying memories of hearth fires, wooden floors, and the steady presence of mothers and grandmothers who believed that a soft voice could calm.
At first, the German soldiers listened with the stiffness of men who had forgotten what gentleness felt like. Their bodies remained tense, shoulders drawn inward, as if any softness might be a hidden trap. For so long, fear had been their constant companion. Fear of capture, fear of punishment, fear of what awaited them in the hands of those they had been taught to hate. But as the nights passed and the lullabies returned like a quiet ritual, something within them began to loosen. The melodies seeped into the cracks of their exhaustion, warming places inside them that had been frozen by months of retreat and loss. Some noticed the change without meaning to. A man who once kept his eyes fixed on the floor now allowed his gaze to wander toward the nurses as they moved gently between the beds. Another who had slept only in shallow bursts since his injury found himself drifting into deeper rest when the songs filled the air. The youngest among them, boys who had been handed rifles before they were old enough to shave, felt the hard knot in their throats ease.
In the days that followed, the ward grew warmer in ways that had nothing to do with fire or blankets. The change showed itself in moments so small they might have gone unnoticed if they weren't so rare in a place shaped by war. A nurse placing a bowl of broth beside a cot would find a prisoner mustering the strength to whisper "Danke" under his breath, the word fragile but sincere. Another would try, with clumsy hands, to straighten his sheets before she arrived, as if to spare her even the smallest task. These gestures were quiet, almost shy, but they carried the weight of something slowly healing. Sometimes, when the nurses checked on their patients, they would catch a fleeting smile or a softened glance, nothing bold, nothing that crossed the strict lines drawn by duty, but enough to show that trust had begun to root. A soldier who once avoided eye contact now let his gaze linger for a moment, studying the gentle way the nurses tied a bandage or tested a fever. Another, older and worn by too many months on the front, tried to share a story in broken Russian, tapping his chest and miming the shape of a memory. The nurses couldn't.
Music moved through the ward in a way no speech or argument ever could. It didn't ask the men to rethink their loyalties or question the beliefs drilled into them. It simply slipped past those defenses, reaching whatever part of them still remembered childhood winters, candlelit kitchens, and the feeling of being held without suspicion. Ideology demanded posture and certainty, but music asked for nothing. It flowed where it wished, ignoring the borders drawn by nations or uniforms, settling instead into the softer corners of the human heart. Even the most hardened prisoners found themselves caught off guard by how a single melody could calm their breath or steady the restless pulse that fear had long controlled. In those moments, the war felt distant, like a storm rumbling on the other side of a mountain. The songs didn't erase what had been done or what still waited beyond the snow-covered fields, but they created a space untouched by hatred. Over time, the lullabies became as much a part of the ward as the lanterns that glowed through the night. What had begun as a spontaneous gesture soon settled into a quiet ritual, arriving each evening with the same gentle certainty as snowfall. As daylight faded and the cold crept in through the seams of the canvas walls, the nurses would finish their rounds, adjust the blankets one last time, and then, almost instinctively, begin to sing. Their voices rose softly, weaving a delicate thread of warmth through the dim, chilly air. The wounded prisoners, already bracing themselves for another long night, felt their breath ease the moment the first notes drifted across the room. The songs carried a calm that medicine alone could not provide. Pain dulled, if only slightly, and the restless shifting that had once filled the ward gave way to stillness. For many of the men, sleep had been a stranger, avoidance born from nightmares, discomfort, and the constant tension of waiting for something else to go wrong. Yet with each night's melody, their bodies surrendered sooner, falling into the first restful slumber they had known in months. Even the groans of pain softened, replaced by the subtle rhythm of steady breathing. Some prisoners closed their eyes not because fatigue demanded it.
Russian lullabies carried with them a quiet wisdom, shaped by centuries of harsh winters, long nights, and the simple hope that love could soften the world's sharpest edges. Their melodies often drifted slowly, like snowflakes falling through still air, each note holding a sense of warmth, earned through endurance. These were songs created in wooden cottages, lit by dim oil lamps, where families gathered close to survive cold seasons that tested both spirit and body. In their gentle rhythms lived the memory of mothers rocking cradles beside crackling stoves, humming not only to soothe the child, but to reassure themselves that tenderness could outlast hardship. Many lullabies spoke of small comforts, stars watching over sleeping children, soft winds brushing past windows, dreams carrying loved ones safely through the night. Others carried deeper echoes, shaped by a country familiar with struggle. They whispered of longing, resilience, and the quiet promise that dawn would always arrive, no matter how long the darkness lingered.
One night, as the familiar lullaby drifted through the ward, one of the younger prisoners, a boy who had tried so hard to appear older than his years, turned his face toward the wall and let his tears fall quietly into the crook of his arm. He had held himself together through capture, through injury, through the long march in the snow, but something in the melody unstitched the last thread of his composure. The nurses did not call attention to it. One simply paused beside his cot, her hand hovering for a moment before gently adjusting his blanket, giving him space to feel what he had long buried. The boy didn't speak, but the soft tremor in his breath said everything. A few beds away, an older soldier who had spent weeks refusing help murmured a faint "Danke, danke," the word barely more than a breath carried on the edge of a sigh. He kept his eyes closed, as if speaking made him too vulnerable, but gratitude slipped through him nonetheless. Another prisoner, whose leg was bound in thick bandages, lifted his hand in a small, hesitant gesture toward a nurse, an unfinished attempt at expressing thanks when language felt too clumsy. She nodded in return, her expression warm and steady. These tiny moments, easily overlooked by the world outside, became the quiet heartbeat of the ward. They revealed the truth that beneath uniforms and fear, each man carried a fragile longing to be seen, to be treated gently, to remember that he was still human.
When the men were finally well enough to leave, the departure felt strangely quiet. There was no triumphant march, no celebratory chorus, only the soft shuffle of boots on frozen ground and the muted breath of winter following close behind. The prisoners, now steadier on their feet, carried their few belongings in small bundles. Yet the heaviest weight they bore was not something they could pack. It lived inside them, tucked somewhere between their ribs and their memories. As they stepped out of the ward and into the pale daylight, the nurses watched with the same gentle composure they had shown throughout the long nights. They offered brief nods, small smiles, and occasionally a whispered farewell, though they knew most of these men would vanish back into a world still tangled in conflict. For the Germans, the road home was filled with contradictions. The war had carved deep shadows in their minds, but amid those shadows lived the soft glow of something unexpected, the sound of lullabies drifting through a Russian hospital. Some tried to make sense of it during the long trip.
Many would later recall that the first real sleep they found after months of dread came not from safety or victory, but from the voices of their former enemies. The memory clung to them gently, like the echo of a hand laid on a fevered brow. And even as they returned to families, to ruined towns, to lives they barely recognized, the lullabies remained. Small reminders that in the harshest season of their lives, humanity had found them in a place they least expected. Kindness has a way of settling into people long after the moment has passed, like warmth absorbed into the skin on a cold day. For the prisoners, the memory of those nightly songs became a quiet compass they carried into the years ahead. In conversations with family, some spoke of Russian nurses with a hint of disbelief, as if they still couldn't fully understand why strangers had shown them gentleness in a time shaped by violence. Others shared nothing at all, yet their lives reflected the change, an extra patience with their children, a deeper softness toward the weak, a silent refusal to let cruelty guide their choices again. The compassion they received did not erase the war, but it softened its edges, proving that even one act of tenderness can leave a permanent imprint. For the nurses, the experience settled differently, but no less deeply. They had tended to countless wounded men, but the memory of singing to those—
In the end, what remained was not the sound of gunfire or the harsh crack of orders shouted across frozen fields. It was something far gentler, a faint melody carried in the memories of those who had lived through nights when the world felt unbearably cold. Long after the hospitals had been dismantled and the snow had melted into spring, the lullabies lingered like echoes of a softer truth, hiding beneath the weight of history. They were reminders that even in places built from fear and necessity, humanity can slip through the smallest openings, refusing to be silenced. People often speak of war as a force that strips life down to its hardest edges, leaving little room for tenderness. Yet inside that dim ward, amid bandages, frost, and restless sleep, something fragile had survived. It lived in the quiet courage of nurses who sang because silence felt too heavy, and in the hesitant hearts of prisoners who allowed themselves, if only for a moment, to feel safe. These moments did not change the course of the war, but they revealed something timeless, that compassion endures even where it seems impossible. And as the years drifted on, the memory of those nights continued to glow softly, proof that in the darkest corners of conflict, a single human gesture can light a small but lasting flame.